This is a Dalarna University production.
Hello and welcome back. My name is Konstantin Andreev, and this is the fourth and final lecture in the Universal Language series. Let us briefly recall what we have discussed so far. In the first lecture, we talked about how natural languages get big and come to serve as lingua francas. We saw that the prominence and dominance of a language have little to do with its linguistic structure. Instead, languages hit the big time thanks to the political, social, cultural, and economic capital of their speakers. In the second lecture, we looked at English, the biggest lingua franca that has ever been spoken on this planet. We saw how English-speaking armies, fleets, pirates, merchants, scientists, inventors, and software developers have all contributed to the unprecedented rise of the language. In the third lecture, we began wondering if natural languages were actually suited to the role of a lingua franca. We saw that their grammatical flourishes and complex sound systems, fascinating and sublime as they are, make them a pain to learn in adulthood. Above all, we saw that natural languages come with national and ethnic strings attached. Throughout history, the spread of a language has meant an unfair advantage for its native speakers. For these reasons, a number of people have tried to create a neutral and relatively simple universal language from scratch. We considered two famous attempts of this kind. We tried to understand why even Esperanto, the most successful artificial lingua franca to date, never quite lived up to the hopes of its creator. Finally, we talked about pidgins and creoles. We wondered if, in a better world, their structure and history might make them an obvious choice for the role of a universal second language. This time, we turn our attention to the future. What will it bring? Will there ever be a neutral universal language, rich in expression but simple in structure? As most people know, predicting the course of human history is an ungrateful task. Unless you phrase your forecasts as pompous gibberish that lends itself to 1,000 interpretations, time is likely to prove you wrong on most, or even on all counts. I don't want to expound pompous gibberish, and needless to say, I don't possess any privileged insight into what is actually going to happen. This is why I am going to talk about what I think ought to happen, in light of what I think is possible. In other words, I'm going to tell you my unabashedly subjective opinion as to what we, as citizens of the world, can do about the dream of a universal language. Do feel free to disagree. Let's start with what is possible. Philosophers might have their issues with induction, but let's face it, in practice, when it comes to what might happen, our best and only guide is our knowledge of what has happened before. In other words, the easiest assumption to make is that the future will bring more of the same. It's going to be business as usual. The linguistic law of the jungle will continue to reign supreme. People will still have to learn the language of whoever is on top of the pile, just like they've always done. People will still be ridiculed, disadvantaged, and ignored because of their imperfect knowledge of some prestige language. This prestige language will, of course, be a natural language with a community of native speakers, who will be the ultimate judges of what is right and what is wrong in that language. They will have the ultimate call on how exactly to pronounce it, on which words go together and which don't go together, because people just don't say it like that. On this business-as-usual assumption, the best scenario we can hope for would be similar to the story of medieval Latin. As you will recall, when Latin was first planted all over Europe by the Roman legions, it certainly had native speakers. But with time, and especially after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, written Latin and vernacular Latin went their separate ways. In other words, medieval Latin, the lingua franca of European learning, religion and diplomacy, was no one's first language. To be sure, you had an easier time with it if you spoke a descendant of vernacular Latin, such as Italian or French. Still, that's about as fair as it gets in the real world out there. Or is it? Could it be different this time? Ever since the spread of Christianity, people in the West have thought about history in apocalyptic terms. Every new generation has felt that it was living at the end of days, and the millennium was nigh, for better or for worse. This generation is no different. I, for one, can't shake the sneaky feeling that there's something unique about this point in history. In fact, I will stick my neck out and say that there are at least 3 factors that make this point in linguistic history a bit special. Of course, that doesn't mean that things will change, but it does give me hope that they might. The first factor is globalization, coupled with the internet. We have always had to negotiate and socialize with speakers of other languages, but this cross-linguistic communication has never involved so many people in so many parts of the world at once. The need for a universal lingua franca, available to everyone regardless of their social or linguistic background, has never been greater. The second factor is machine translation. To be sure, translation software is still in its infancy. Worse still, our interpretation of linguistic signs depends on all kinds of context to such a degree that machine interpreters may never become completely reliable. But then again, who has ever met a completely reliable human interpreter? And even today's crude translation tools already allow you at least to get the gist of a text that would otherwise seem impenetrable. Consider these rows of Russian letters. If you can't actually read Russian, chances are you won't have a clue what the text is about, apart from the 2 numbers, 23 and 16. Now let's see what Google Translate can make of it. This is an excerpt from one of my favorite Chekhov stories, The Bride, also translated as the fiancée or a marriageable girl. I wouldn't go so far as to say that Google Translate does justice to Chekhov's prose. To begin with, it thinks that the proper noun Nadia, the protagonist's name, is a verb, and that despite the capital N and the dative case ending. In other words, the enigmatic "she was hoping it was 23 years" should read "Nadia was already 23." 16 years, in its turn, should read "since she was 16." And there are quite a few other misses too. Having said that, you understand what's going on here, don't you? It works. Translation software works. In fact, it works pretty well if instead of confronting it with Chekhov, you simply wanted to say something like «Выходи за меня замуж». And we can be reasonably sure that machine translation is going to get better, even for less common language pairs than English and Russian. The third factor is probably the most controversial, which is why I'm naming it last. You see, I'm what a philosopher might call a moral realist. I don't believe that moral truths come from some transcendent realm, but I do believe that moral truths exist. I believe that they exist as valid inferences from the collective experience of living beings. Any moral realist worthy of the label must believe in the possibility of moral progress, at least in theory. I'll go further than that and claim that some moral progress has actually taken place on this very planet. I'm not saying that this progress is universal or that it is irreversible. I simply believe that there is what philosopher Peter Singer calls the expanding circle of moral concern, and that this circle has in fact been expanding. I'll give you an example, not in order to try and convince you, but simply to clarify what I mean by moral progress, and what it has to do with the topic of universal languages. It is fair to say that today, in 2015, the world is chock full of prejudice. There is prejudice based on gender, prejudice based on skin color, religion, lack of religion, social background, sexual preference, you name it. Whatever society you take, you will soon discover that in that society it's a lot easier to be a certain kind of person. That being a certain kind of person opens doors, while being some other kind of person often closes them. Take the so-called Western world, including magical, progressive Scandinavia, where I happen to live. All other things being equal, even here it is still easier to make almost any kind of career if you are a white, heterosexual male like myself. Of course, prejudice and discrimination are constants of human history. What is striking about much of today's world is not the sexism or the racism or the homophobia. What's striking is that so many of us feel that it's not okay to be prejudiced. Until quite recently, most of what we call prejudice was known as common sense and blatantly institutionalized. Recall, for instance, how at the start of the 20th century, a grand total of one country, New Zealand, allowed all women to vote in national elections. To cut a long story short, the third factor that I think ought to affect the future of lingua francas is a change in moral zeitgeist. I will call it awareness of prejudice. Language is a particularly powerful trigger of both negative and positive bias, and so I hope that the relevance of this factor doesn't need much further explanation. With those three factors in mind, I will now outline three different universal lingua franca scenarios of varying degrees of idealism. Scenario number 1. I will call it the raving mad, tinfoil hat, bleeding heart idealist scenario. It will involve creating a truly universal lingua franca from scratch and implementing it in a joint international effort. Imagine a well-funded multinational institute set up by the United Nations to design a maximally neutral and adult learner-friendly auxiliary language. What do I mean by adult learner-friendly? Well, for instance, this language won't have a large set of distinct sounds, of phonemes, as a linguist would call them. After all, if a fully functional natural language such as Maori is able to get by with just 15 phonemes, there is no real reason why a global lingua franca should have many more. About 20 phonemes might be a good number. Tok Pisin, the English-based Creole that is one of the official languages of Papua New Guinea, has just over 20. By comparison, the so-called general American accent of English has about 40. The ideal global lingua franca will also have truly international phonotactics. That is to say, rules for which sound clusters are possible and which are not. Some languages allow extremely complex consonant clusters. Consider, for example, the bulstrun, gsnv, and zj. It has enviable strengths that other brands just don't have. These mouthfuls might seem normal to speakers of Indo-European languages, but many other big languages such as Japanese or Vietnamese allow no such monstrosities. Our ideal universal language shouldn't allow them either. Nor will it allow any geographical bias in vocabulary. Roots for the ideal lingua franca will be carefully selected from a genuinely representative sample of languages and then modified to fit the sound system. Where necessary, very long words will be clipped, extra consonants will be discarded, and extra vowels will be inserted. I could go on daydreaming about the structure of this ideal auxiliary language for many, many lectures, but you get the idea. Throw in a simultaneous worldwide launch, the need to train thousands of teachers, the need to translate a huge body of information into the new language, the need to create incentives to learn it. Well, it's obvious why this is never gonna happen anywhere outside the Noon universe, the beautiful communist utopia of the Strugatsky brothers' early books. Scenario number 2 then. Let's call it the hopelessly idealist scenario, in which a grassroots movement promoting a relatively neutral auxiliary language, such as Esperanto, will gather momentum and eventually triumph. Don't get me wrong, I would really want this to happen. In fact, I encourage everyone to learn Esperanto, or at least sign this petition at lapromeso.com and promise to learn it once 10 million other people have made the same promise. For my part, I fully intend to continue going to Esperanto conferences and use my Esperanto whenever I have a moment to spare. But that's the thing. For a grassroots movement to succeed in reaching its ultimate goal, people can't treat it as a hobby, or even as a lifestyle, as many dedicated Esperantists do. It seems to me that you need a lot of people who are really worked up about a particular injustice, a lot of angry people whose anger resonates with the general population. Then there's the additional complication that I talked about in Lecture 3. Learning a language, even as simple as Esperanto, requires a lot more commitment than, say, marching in protest against linguistic imperialism or recording a series of lectures about the universal language. Esperanto sums up this problem very nicely in the concept of eterna comencanto, eternal beginner. Someone who really likes the idea of a neutral lingua franca and keeps showing up at Esperanto gatherings, but never actually gets round to learning the language. The sad, unavoidable truth that mastering a language takes time and effort brings me to the last idealist scenario on my list. Let's call it the reasonably idealist scenario. If you think that reasonably idealist is a contradiction in terms, thank you for listening so far. Otherwise, listen on. As we have seen, we seem to be trapped in a catch-22 situation. Most people will only learn an already established natural lingua franca because most people are only prepared to go to the trouble of learning a language if it has an obvious practical payoff. But even when there is such a payoff, the time and effort that most adults can actually spare for language learning are almost never enough to master a natural language to anywhere near the degree of proficiency of a native speaker. This wouldn't be an issue if the lingua franca had no native speakers, but only idealists ever bother to learn lingua francas that have no native speakers, so we're back to square one. I can see only one way out of this vicious circle. We badly need a global lingua franca, and we already seem to have one, namely English, spoken as a second language by several 100 million people all around the world. English is of course a natural language with millions of native speakers, who by definition will always have an unfair advantage when it comes to learning it. That injustice we can't undo. At the same time, I believe we can exercise our awareness of prejudice when it comes to using English. Let me show you what I mean by that. Listen to this. Listen very carefully. Last speakers, probably of half of the languages of the world, are alive today. When they will grow old and die, their voices will become silent. Their children and grandchildren, in the overwhelming majority, will choose not to learn or will be deprived from opportunity to learn ancestral language. Most of the languages in the world never were written down anywhere or scientifically described. We even don't know what exactly we lose for science, for humanity, for posterity when languages die. Huge mountain of human knowledge, meticulously assembled over thousands of years by uncountable minds, is eroding, disappearing into oblivion. If you think it was difficult to understand, play it again. You will understand it, I promise. And if you think I am faking Russian accent, think one more time. I can't fake Russian accent because it's my native accent. It's my native accent in English as lingua franca. But I can fake British accent. I was taught to fake British accent at university. And this is what I have been doing during all this lecture series, by the way. I apologize to American field linguist David Harrison for tampering with the opening paragraph of his wonderful book, When Languages Die, which I encourage everyone to read. I hope you will forgive me, because I used that paragraph to make an important point. As I have already said, I read the paragraph in my native Russian accent, with just a few modifications. For example, I used ng. I used w instead of v. I used something like a rhotic approximant instead of the trilled Russian r. And I didn't devoice consonants at the end of words, which is something I always do in Russian. I also tried to articulate each word very, very carefully. This is why I am quite confident that you eventually understood what I said, once you had got used to the accent. Yes, accents, native and non-native alike, do take some getting used to if you haven't been exposed to them before. There's no way around it. I also skipped a bunch of articles. I used will in a subclause referring to the future. I made some word choices that would sound odd to most native speakers of English, or to very proficient speakers of native-like English. But I'm pretty sure that those grammatical and lexical oddities did not in any way prevent you from understanding the text. That paragraph, as it was formulated and spoken by me a few moments ago, was a perfectly fine example of English as a lingua franca. There was nothing wrong with it. I will repeat. That paragraph, how it was formulated and spoken by me some moments ago, was perfectly okay example of English as lingua franca. Nothing was wrong with it. At this point you might want to ask, if there's nothing wrong with it, why don't you talk like that all the time? That's a good question. It presupposes that I have a choice, and yes, I do have a choice, because I was an English major, and I spent my 5 years in college rote learning English collocations and aping British tapes. 5 bloody years. Just to give you a taste of what it was like, for one of my courses I had to memorize and recite an audiobook of Alice in Wonderland. It was an abridged, modernized version, but it still ran to dozens of pages. Needless to say, the vast majority of non-native speakers of English don't have the time for such silliness. Most people have other things to study, things like philosophy, history, art, engineering, cosmology, chemistry, particle physics. People have jobs to do, deadlines to meet, children to take care of, and friends to hang out with. People can't possibly be expected to waste their lives learning how exactly to articulate 15 vowels, or where exactly to place adverbs, or how to express future in subclauses as opposed to main clauses, or which preposition to use after deprived. In her book Understanding English as a Lingua Franca, Barbara Seidelhofer points out that, and I quote, "Intelligibility is directly related to the conscious or unconscious willingness or unwillingness to understand." End of quote. A number of studies suggest that too often people just don't make the minimal effort required to understand, let alone take seriously, someone who doesn't speak quite normal. This kind of prejudice is perhaps sometimes excusable when it comes to foreign language learning. As they say, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. If you are learning a language in order to communicate with a particular community of native speakers, you might be expected to try and talk like them. But if you are learning a global lingua franca in order to talk to everyone, then anyone who refuses to take you seriously because of your collocations or your noticeable French, Polish, Chinese or Farsi accent is ultimately a prejudiced asshole. I do apologize, but I can't think of a more suitable term. As Barbara Seidelhofer argues in the same book, if we want to minimize the inherent injustice of using a natural language as the world's lingua franca, we need, and I quote, "unprecedented ideas as to what it means to speak a language to achieve effective communication." End of quote. Here I both agree and disagree with Seidelhofer. I agree that the unreflected, common sense notion of language as a closed system has no place in a discussion of a global lingua franca. Language is not a set of equations. In the words of linguist Paul Hopper, I quote, "Our speech is a vast collection of hand-me-downs that reaches back in time to the beginnings of language. The aggregation of changes and adjustments that are made to this inheritance on each individual occasion of use results in a constant erosion and replacement of the sediment of usage that is called grammar." End of quote. The idea of a language standard set in stone is a product of nation-state building, ultimately rooted in tribal thinking. However, I don't think that the liberating view of lingua franca English as no one's linguistic property is unprecedented. There is a historical precedent, namely Esperanto, as it is actually used. You will recall that Esperanto has a limited set of very general rules and a core vocabulary that everyone agrees on, but it has nothing like the thousands of syntactic, lexical or phonological patterns that make up the structure of natural language. It has no native accent, no native word order, and no native collocations. If a particularly opinionated Esperantist tells you that some words don't go together because people just don't say it like that, you have every right not to care about that opinion. This is exactly what I think ought to happen to English as a lingua franca. If we are stuck with English, sooner or later we have to start treating it as if it didn't have native speakers. If that happens, the dream of Ludwig Zamenhof, Esperanto's creator, will be vindicated in its most crucial respect. English as a lingua franca will have become an Esperanto in the sense that many of its linguistic features will be much more fluid and open to variation than the native speaker speech habits of natural languages. In fact, this is already happening. In its actual use throughout the world, English as a lingua franca is becoming ever less English and ever more lingua franca. I don't mean that it's developing some new rules or vocabulary, although that happens too. In fact, it happens over and over again, as groups of people with different language backgrounds come together and do their best to communicate, using whatever they remember from their English classes or their favorite TV shows, and filling in the gaps with whatever else comes to mind. No. The change I'm talking about is that people seem to be caring less and less about how exactly they fill those gaps, as long as they get their message across. I can only hope that it's the beginning of a larger zeitgeist change in how we define English. I very much hope that it's one step on the long road to the world in which it would be just as probable that you get to the end of this lecture series even if I had spoken like this from very beginning. Like John Lennon said, you can say I'm a dreamer, but I believe that there is a chance for such a world where people don't think your words are more important and more intelligent if you say them in particular accent, with particular prepositions, and no future tense in subordinate clauses. In fact, I believe we even can have a world where people can't ignore you even if you choose not to speak some universal language. Remember what I said about machine translation? Remember that? Computational linguists and software developers, please keep working on it. Everyone should have the right to speak the language that they know best of all. And you are the only people who can make that dream reality. Большое спасибо за внимание. Удачи всем!